Honestly, I think that Ori and the Will of the Wisps is one of the best 2D jump and run games what was ever made. And right now I'm just talking about gameplay and story. If we're now taking into consideration the absolute fantastic audio and visual quality of this game, then we're really talking about a masterpiece. Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. Before we start, I have a big favor to ask. If you're new to my channel, please do me a big favor and like, share and subscribe. I would much appreciate this. And now let's talk about HDR, or let's talk about Ori and the Will of the Wisps. The initial release of this game was already in March 2020 for the PC, for the Xbox and for the Switch. In this video we're talking about the PC version and the Xbox version because here we have native HDR support. And no one else than evil Boris helped Moon Studios back then to implement HDR in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. And so far I can tell you, they did a fantastic job. The only thing I like to complain about the HDR implementation in Ori and the Will of the Wisp is the standard factory setting when we're talking about the HDR settings, because they are not quite right. But this is really complaining on a very high level. So first of all, we need to consider or take into consideration that this game does not support the HDR system level calibration on Windows 11 or the Xbox. But this is not a big surprise because again, this game was released already in 2020. And when we're now talking about the HDR settings, what we have in the game, we have actually a lot. Probably a little bit too much because it can be very overwhelming, especially when you don't know what you're doing. But no worries at all, I analyzed all the settings and I will keep it very quick. I will just tell you which setting you should change and which setting you shouldn't touch at all. The first two settings what we have on the very top are called brightness and contrast, and I would strongly recommend leave the settings where they are. Leave them at 100 because if you touch them, you will just mess up your picture. The standard factory setting in this case is pretty much spot on. The next setting is called saturation and you can change this if you like it. Later on when we're talking about my preferred settings, I actually recommend to increase it slightly. The next setting what we have is called base brightness setting, and now we're talking about the first setting actually for HDR, and this setting is very important for the average picture brightness and the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And then again we have a setting called contrast, but this contrast setting is slightly different to the contrast setting above, and in this case it is actually a must to change this setting to have a proper HDR presentation. And then we have the user interface brightness, which is really just changing the user interface elements on the screen. So feel free to change this setting as you like it. And then we have the setting richness, which is changing, I would say, the color tone from the picture. So I would strongly recommend do not touch this setting. And last but not least, we have the shadow detail setting, and this setting is very helpful if you can't see very fine details on very dark objects. So let's talk quickly about the quality of the HDR implementation in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. So let's start with the HDR black level floor, and you know if you're watching my channel regularly that this is one of the most important features actually, because without a proper HDR black level floor or without a proper black level floor in general, the same counts for SDR content, the whole game or the whole picture is actually, in my opinion, ruined. But the good news is that we don't have any issues at all, not at all with the HDR black level floor. And yeah, the only thing to complain is actually that with the standard factory setting, I found the picture slightly too dark, and also you're crushing some details in very dark objects. But again, this is just complaining on a very high level, and with my recommended settings, it's actually already much better. The specular highlights in this game are just on a different level in my opinion, because we have so many fine details, so many specular highlights on the screen at the same time. It's absolutely fantastic. So the overall presentation of this game is actually very dark at most of the time, but this is actually good because then we can have, thanks to the HDR black level floor, to the perfect HDR black level floor, we can have a absolute fantastic contrast. So this makes this game so special because we have a very dark presentation, and with the right settings actually we're not losing any details in very dark objects. And on top we have now very bright specular highlights. This makes this game so awesome. And before we're now talking about my recommended settings, I like to show you a comparison. On the very top we have the standard factory settings, and that means I haven't touched the HDR settings at all. And on the very bottom we have Evil Boris recommendation from 2020 with a very slight adjustment to actually fit the maximum peak brightness on my LG G2. And on the bottom right side we have my recommendation, which is very similar to Evil Boris settings but with some tweaking. I will leave it up to you to decide which one you like better, because at the end of the day it's a personal preference, and maybe you don't like it at all. So now let's talk about my recommended settings for this game, and I like to make it very easy and simple for you. So first of all, we have brightness and contrast on the very top. So again, my recommendation is do not touch those two settings. The next setting what we have is called saturation, and I would recommend to change this setting to 120%. And then we're jumping straight to contrast because we're talking about base brightness setting a little bit later. So contrast is very important, and you must decrease this to 0.50. So again, contrast, decrease to 0.50. The next one is user interface brightness, and I told you already you can change this setting as you like it. Then we have the richness setting, and my recommendation is do not touch it. And last but not least, we have the shadow detail setting, and I would recommend to change this setting to 1.25. So and now let's talk about how to set up the base brightness in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. And in the very beginning I was going to, or my plan was actually to provide you with a table with some sort of a list for different maximum peak brightness settings. But after I learned that the Xbox version and the PC version are actually different in terms of settings, I decided to do it slightly different. And all what you have to do is start a new game, and after roughly 1 minute of playing the game, you should see this sequence here, this scene. And all what you have to do is pause the game when Ori is closing his eyes. And all what we have to do now is opening the HDR settings, and we focusing on the eyebrows from Ori. And if you have followed my recommendations so far, then that means the base brightness should still be at 1.0, contrast should be set to 0.50, and shadow details should be set to 1.25. And with my recommended settings right now, the maximum peak brightness and specular highlights should be around 400 to 500 nits. All what we have to do now is we start increasing the base brightness carefully. And while you're increasing the base brightness slowly, focus on very fine details on the main character, like the eyebrows. As soon you can see some clipping or fading from very fine details, stop increasing the value. And by the way, on my LG OLED TVs, I had the best experience and outcome when I was using HDR during setting up the base brightness. But again, feel free to use dynamic tone mapping on, or on the Xbox Series, Dolby Vision. And if everything went according to plan, you should have a very powerful picture with very bright specular highlights and with a perfect HDR black level floor. Okay, my friends, so that's it for this video, and I hope you like my recommended settings. But if you have different settings what you like to share, then just put them in the comment section. In my opinion, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a masterpiece. It's a must play. If you have a PC, if you have an Xbox, download the game, because it is on Game Pass actually at the moment, and you should not miss out this masterpiece.